Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. The Vietnam War, a decade of conflict and controversy, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, Origins of a Quagmire. Vietnam, a country in Southeast Asia with a long history of colonialism, was thrust into a period of turmoil and bloodshed in the mid-20th century. In this chapter, we'll explore the early history of Vietnam and the events that led to the outbreak of hostilities in 1954, including French colonial rule, the rise of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, and the division of Vietnam into North and South. French colonial rule. Vietnam had been under French colonial rule since the late 19th century. The French had established their presence in the country through a combination of military conquest and diplomacy, and by the 1930s, Vietnam was an important part of the French Empire in Southeast Asia. However, French rule was marked by exploitation and oppression, and the Vietnamese people were subject to harsh working conditions and economic exploitation. As a result, many Vietnamese began to resent French rule and began to organize resistance movements to fight for independence. The rise of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. One of the most prominent leaders of the Vietnamese independence movement was Ho Chi Minh. Born in 1890, Ho Chi Minh was a committed nationalist who had spent time in France and had been influenced by Marxist ideology. He had founded the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930, and by the 1940s, he was leading a resistance movement against the French. Ho Chi Minh's resistance movement was known as the Viet Minh, and it consisted of a coalition of nationalist and communist forces. The Viet Minh waged a guerrilla war against the French, using tactics such as ambushes and hit-and-run attacks to wear down the French forces. The division of Vietnam. In 1954, the French were defeated by the Viet Minh in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The French were forced to withdraw from Vietnam, and the country was divided into two separate states, the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the non-Communist South, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. The division of Vietnam was supposed to be temporary, with a reunification election scheduled for 1956. However, the election was never held, and the two states remained separate, setting the stage for the Vietnam War. In conclusion, the origins of the Vietnam War can be traced back to the early history of Vietnam and the country's experience of colonialism and resistance. The French colonial rule and subsequent Vietnamese struggle for independence led to the rise of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, which in turn led to the division of the country into North and South. The failure to hold reunification elections in 1956 set the stage for the conflict that would rage for the next 2 decades. Chapter 2, Escalation and Stalemate. In the mid-1960s, the United States significantly increased its military involvement in Vietnam. The American strategy of attrition aimed to wear down the North Vietnamese forces through sustained military pressure. However, this strategy proved ineffective, and the war entered a period of stalemate. In this chapter, we'll cover the period from the mid-1960s to the late 1960s, exploring the American strategy, the Tet Offensive, and the anti-war movement at home. The American strategy. In 1964, the United States passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized the use of military force in Vietnam. The American strategy was based on the idea of attrition, which aimed to wear down the North Vietnamese forces through sustained military pressure. The American military conducted a bombing campaign against North Vietnam, known as Operation Rolling Thunder, and deployed ground troops to South Vietnam to support the South Vietnamese Army. The American military also attempted to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people by providing aid and support to the South Vietnamese government. However, the American strategy was met with stiff resistance from the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, the communist guerrilla forces in the South. The North Vietnamese were able to adapt to the American tactics, and the war entered a period of stalemate. The Tet Offensive. In January 1968, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong launched a surprise attack on American and South Vietnamese forces during the Vietnamese New Year, known as Tet. The Tet Offensive was a turning point in the war, as it demonstrated that the North Vietnamese were still capable of mounting large-scale attacks against American forces. Although the American military was ultimately able to repel the Tet Offensive, the attack shattered the American public's confidence in the war. The American public had been led to believe that the war was going well, and the Tet Offensive exposed the gap between the official narrative and the reality on the ground. The anti-war movement, the Tet Offensive, also sparked a wave of anti-war sentiment in the United States. The American public began to question the government's justification for the war and the effectiveness of the American strategy. The anti-war movement grew in strength, with protests and demonstrations taking place across the country. The anti-war movement was led by a diverse coalition of groups, including students, civil rights activists, and religious leaders. The movement was fueled by the growing number of casualties and the realization that the war was not going to be easily won. In conclusion, the period from the mid-1960s to the late 1960s was marked by the American strategy of attrition and the subsequent stalemate in the war. The Tet Offensive demonstrated the resilience of the North Vietnamese forces and shattered the American public's confidence in the war. The anti-war movement grew in strength, fueled by the growing number of casualties and the realization that the war was not going to be easily won. Chapter 3: Nixon and the Search for Peace. In 1969, Richard Nixon became President of the United States and inherited the Vietnam War. Nixon was determined to end the war, but his strategy for achieving peace was controversial and ultimately unsuccessful. In this chapter, we'll examine the period from 1969 to 1973, during which Nixon attempted to extricate the United States from Vietnam through a combination of military escalation and diplomatic negotiation. Nixon's strategy for ending the war was based on a two-pronged approach: military escalation and diplomatic negotiation. On the one hand, Nixon increased the bombing campaign against North Vietnam, with the aim of pressuring the North Vietnamese into negotiating a peace agreement. On the other hand, Nixon sought to engage in diplomacy with the North Vietnamese and establish a framework for peace talks. Nixon's strategy was controversial, as it relied on the use of military force to achieve a political end. Many critics argued that the strategy was flawed and would lead to a prolonged and costly war. The secret bombing of Cambodia. One of the most controversial aspects of Nixon's strategy was the secret bombing campaign against Cambodia. The United States conducted a massive bombing campaign against Cambodia, with the aim of disrupting the North Vietnamese supply lines that ran through the country. The bombing campaign was kept secret from the American public and was not authorized by Congress. When the bombing campaign was exposed, it sparked a wave of protests and led to increased scrutiny of the Nixon administration's conduct of the war. The Paris Peace Accords. In 1973, after years of negotiations, the United States and North Vietnam signed the Paris Peace Accords. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam, and a political settlement that would allow for the reunification of Vietnam. The Paris Peace Accords were a significant achievement for Nixon, as they represented a step towards ending the war. However, the agreement was flawed and did not lead to a lasting peace. The North Vietnamese violated the ceasefire, and the war continued until the fall of Saigon in 1975. The Watergate scandal. The Paris Peace Accords were overshadowed by the Watergate scandal, which ultimately led to Nixon's resignation in 1974. The scandal erupted after it was revealed that Nixon had authorized illegal activities, including the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, in order to secure his re-election in 1972. The Watergate scandal damaged Nixon's reputation and credibility, and it cast a shadow over his efforts to end the war in Vietnam. The scandal also highlighted the growing disillusionment with the government and the political system, which had been fueled by the prolonged and divisive conflict in Vietnam. In conclusion, Nixon's search for peace in Vietnam was marked by controversy and ultimately proved unsuccessful. Nixon's strategy of military escalation and diplomatic negotiation was criticized by many, and the secret bombing of Cambodia sparked protests and increased scrutiny of the government's conduct of the war. The Paris Peace Accords represented a step towards ending the war, but the agreement was flawed and did not lead to a lasting peace. The Watergate scandal, which erupted during this period, further eroded public confidence in the government and highlighted the growing disillusionment with the political system. Chapter 4: The Fall of Saigon. In the final years of the Vietnam War, the United States was struggling to maintain its presence in Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government was corrupt and ineffective, and the North Vietnamese forces were growing stronger. In this chapter, we'll cover the events that led to the fall of Saigon, including the collapse of the South Vietnamese government, the evacuation of American personnel from Saigon, and the aftermath of the conflict. The collapse of the South Vietnamese government. By the early 1970s, the South Vietnamese government was in disarray. Corruption was rampant, and the government was unable to maintain control over large parts of the country. The North Vietnamese forces were growing stronger, and the South Vietnamese army was demoralized and poorly equipped. In 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive against the South Vietnamese forces. The South Vietnamese army was quickly overwhelmed, and the North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, on April 30, 1975. The evacuation of American personnel. The fall of Saigon prompted a frantic effort to evacuate American personnel and Vietnamese refugees from the city. The evacuation, known as Operation Frequent Wind, was one of the largest helicopter evacuations in history, and it involved the airlift of over 7,000 American and Vietnamese personnel from Saigon to nearby aircraft carriers. The evacuation was chaotic and dangerous, with helicopters landing on rooftops and crowds of people fighting to board the helicopters. The evacuation was successful in saving thousands of lives, but it was also a symbol of the failure of American policy in Vietnam. The aftermath of the conflict. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War, but it also marked the beginning of a period of turmoil and upheaval in Vietnam. The country was left in a state of political and economic disarray, and the reunification of the country was not without conflict and struggle. Many South Vietnamese officials and supporters were targeted for retribution by the new communist government, and thousands of people were imprisoned or executed. The country also faced economic difficulties as it struggled to recover from the devastation of the war. In conclusion, the fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War, but it also represented a period of turmoil and upheaval in Vietnam. The collapse of the South Vietnamese government, the chaotic evacuation of American personnel, and the aftermath of the conflict highlighted the failure of American policy in Vietnam and the devastating human toll of the war. The Vietnam War had a profound impact on both American and Vietnamese society, and its legacy continues to be felt today. Chapter 5: Legacy and Lessons. The Vietnam War was one of the most divisive and controversial conflicts in American history. The war had a profound impact on American society and foreign policy, and its legacy continues to be felt today. In this chapter, we'll examine the long-term impact of the Vietnam War on American society and foreign policy and explore the lessons that policymakers and military leaders have drawn from the experience of Vietnam. Impact on American society. The Vietnam War had a profound impact on American society. The war was highly divisive, with many Americans opposing the conflict and protesting against it. The anti-war movement was one of the most significant social movements of the 1960s and 1970s, and it represented a turning point in American history. The Vietnam War also had a significant impact on American veterans. Many veterans returned from the war with physical and psychological injuries, and they faced significant challenges in reintegrating into civilian life. The treatment of veterans after the war was a source of controversy and contributed to a growing disillusionment with the government and the military. Impact on foreign policy. The Vietnam War had a significant impact on American foreign policy. The war represented a failure of American policy in Southeast Asia, and it led to a re-evaluation of American military interventions abroad. The United States became more cautious in its use of military force and more skeptical of the idea of interventionism. The Vietnam War also had a significant impact on international relations. The war led to a rift between the United States and its allies, and it contributed to a growing sense of distrust between the United States and the rest of the world. The war also contributed to the rise of anti-American sentiment in many parts of the world. Lessons learned: the Vietnam War was a difficult and costly conflict, and policymakers and military leaders have drawn many lessons from the experience. One of the most significant lessons is the importance of understanding the local context of a conflict. The United States failed to understand the historical and cultural context of Vietnam, and this contributed to the failure of American policy. Another lesson is the importance of having a clear objective in a conflict. The United States never had a clear objective in Vietnam, and this contributed to the lack of success in the conflict. Having a clear objective can help to guide decision-making and ensure that resources are used effectively. In conclusion, the Vietnam War was a difficult and costly conflict that had a profound impact on American society and foreign policy. The war represented a failure of American policy in Southeast Asia, and it led to a re-evaluation of American military interventions abroad. The war also had a significant impact on international relations, contributing to a growing sense of distrust between the United States and the rest of the world. Policymakers and military leaders have drawn many lessons from the experience of Vietnam, including the importance of understanding the local context of a conflict and having a clear objective. The legacy of the Vietnam War continues to be felt today, and it serves as a reminder of the dangers of military interventionism and the importance of understanding the complexities of the world in which we live. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.